I started my career in the early mid 1980s, and it's a world that shockingly people don't even recall now, unless you have gray hair like mine, just about, which is the Cold War, and the world was divided in two. There's the Soviet Union and the United States, or the West. And so the focus of the CIA, our number one priority, it's called an operational directive. Those are the ranking of our tasks, what we were supposed to work on. Always had, of course, the Soviet Union and communism as the number one target in our terminology and issue. So even though I was not a Soviet specialist, I don't speak Russian or Slavic language, and wasn't in the, I'll call it the Soviet division. Everybody worked on the Cold War, and I had any number of times, and I'll have to be a little fuzzy, direct work on Russian and Soviet issues. Sure. Well, I certainly agree with the overall strategic shift of the United States over a period of 25, 35 years, really 25 to 30 years, from having the Soviet Union as the number one priority to having China. And that's, all the data shows that really there's only one peer competitor of the United States, and that is China. And peer competitor may be praising the United States more than it deserves at this point, depending on the issue. So strategically, in the macro sense, that is all sensible, and I agree with those changes. In fact, the United States was trying, and the intelligence community was trying to change its focus to prioritize Asia and China before the terrorist attack of September 11, years before. But terrorism diverted American attention and resources, and those of the intelligence community, for 20 years. That said, when I was working and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and even after I was working, now I don't have access to data and I can't say anything classified, of course, but it's, I think, an easy thing to say, and not revealing something that I shouldn't, that the Russian intelligence services had more officers active and residing in the United States, targeting the United States and Western interests, than the CIA employed in the world. Think of that. And that didn't change when the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia became what? No longer the millennial, Soviet Union trying to bring world revolution, in theory. So that hasn't changed. And Vladimir Putin, a rough contemporary of mine, was not a career. Well, he was a career KGB officer. He didn't spend his entire career doing it, but that's what formed his worldview and his approach to international relations. So for the West, for the United States in particular, to divert its eye and attention from Russia is an error. It's a huge error. I actually didn't start focusing on Trump and Russia and the connections of the two after the reports of the Russian disinformation intelligence and approach about the American election and Trump campaign had become publicly in the public domain, but at least a year prior to that, and I cannot prove this, but I think I was the first person to say in public to raise concerns about the associations of Russian intelligence with the Trump campaign, Trump enterprise, and Trump himself. But that was myself. Just note, as a professional intelligence officer, things just jumped out And I became progressively alarmed, even nearly frantic, about the significance of this and the desire that American authorities uh, be aware and focused on this. And I couldn't imagine that I, sitting alone as a retired officer, would be the only one who would notice this, and I'm sure I wasn't. But it was well more than a year prior to things becoming public that I was alarmed. I think it's um, a disharmony or a incomprehension of the lay person and the public, and even officials uh, on one side, with on the other professional intelligence officers. And I have something I've said in many interviews, and to always the same reaction, which is sort of no reaction, which is that it's shocking. People would be flabbergasted. The average person would be and should be flabbergasted if they were aware of the pervasiveness of the influence of intelligence agencies on what we believe is happening as citizens or observers of public affairs, and what is happening. And that include there almost any intelligence service is in some way active, but the big ones, of course, are the ones playing the real role. And there's almost nothing that happens in the news that has not in some way been touched upon by, is being acted upon by, or has been shaped by an intelligence service. It really is stunning. Now, the immediate response, and it's an obvious one to make, I'm aware of the vulnerability of opening from making such an assertion, is that, well, that sounds just insanely paranoid, and you're hyper over focused, obsessed with what you spent your time doing, and that's simply not possible at all. Um, would that it were so, but it really is shocking how powerful the and pervasive intelligence operations are. So that Russia would be doing this is not surprising. They have acted upon every other society from the get-go, from 1917, when they took over from what the Tsar was doing. But the current professionalism and success and the strategies and the techniques they're using, because the world is a different technological and social place now, are more powerful, more effective. Well, I don't think we need to have a legacy of, excuse me, communism or even totalitarianism for what you say to be correct. Of course, the enemy of one's enemy is one's friend, and international relations is an amoral business. So, to the extent that any nation can leverage others for its own national interests and purposes, it will do so, and certainly China is quite happy to have Russia creating headaches for the West in Central Europe as one specific example. And in any other way that they may leverage another state's interests for their own purposes, they will do so. All nations will do that, certainly. The only nations that don't, to some slight degree, and that's a little more cynically stated than I actually believe, is frankly the West. And the normative system, much derided by the third world. We can no longer say third world. We have to say, what the heck do we say? Global South now we say. Um, uh, is frankly a legacy and triumph of Soviet and Marxist propaganda. The normative system is not fictitious, and it is grossly imperfect, but it is also more substantive and real from the efforts of the United States since 1945 than ever in human history. And that normative system does, except on issues of vital existential national security interests as perceived by American leaders or other leaders, that normative system does shape the behavior and constrain the behavior of, regulate, let's say, the behavior of Western nations in a way that is not the case for Russia or China. Now, that view, the cynicism about the normative system is sincerely held by hundreds of millions of people, but that doesn't mean it's correct. You know, most people in the world are religious, and they believe that their particular religion is the universal truth. And of course, that's you know, that's not possible, that every religion be the universal truth and then there be multiple religions. And so the solution, of course, is that we all go around massacring each other for our truths. No, it's simply not true. The objective data is so overwhelming that it shouldn't even need any discussion whatsoever. You compare the actions of the United States from those of other hegemons in human history, and the United States has constrained itself and has allowed itself to lose various arguments an infinite number of times, and does play by rules that it took the primary lead in standing up and creating. But then the results are just stunning in how that system adduces to the general welfare rather than solely to the welfare of the hegemon of the United States. You look at infant mortality and women's rights and contractual respect for contracts and opportunities for non-American, non-hegemon entities, whether it's Airbus or Bata in India or Ibrahim's vegetable stand in Marrakesh to thrive in ways that have never happened in human history, and for nations to run their own affairs. I mean, this is just categorically true. And now, of course, were you a Russian counterpart of mine on the air, you would smile cynically and talk about, how I am you'd say I'm an agent of the CIA. And so therefore, of course, one can't believe anything that I'm saying. But if I were not, if it were you speaking with the Russian, that they would say how naive you are to have believed the propaganda that you have been fed for all your entire life, when, of course, we know that nations are cynical, blah, 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 blah. Projecting to give them the best interpretation, the most kind interpretation of what they're doing possible, projecting their own hideous history onto the behavior of other states, which we all do. Of course, we all project our own cultural norms, but that is simply not the truth. Not the truth. I have this occur. This issue comes up almost literally every day for me in my post-agency career, because, as you said, I am a columnist and I appear frequently on media around the world. Less so in the United States now, because my book is not fresh, and I haven't been in the agents for a while, and I was not the director of the CIA. I was just one CIA guy among a number. But the foreigners like me more because I hope they find me articulate, and I do offer insights from an American intelligence foreign policy perspective that are unusual to have access to. But in all of these interviews, this paradigm and these assumptions dominate, and I spend all my time essentially trying to say, well, that actually you were projecting preconceptions that do not correlate with the reality. But it's, if not a losing argument, an endless one, never won.
Many of you generously contributed to buying a truck, a 4x4 vehicle, for the armed forces of Ukraine in our recent marathon fundraiser for Car for Ukraine. That vehicle was delivered thanks to your generosity and refitted in Lviv with life-saving reinforcements, the doors, windows, and the engine area. That vehicle was destroyed a few weeks after it was delivered at the front in a drone attack. All 3 servicemen survived, with only minor scratches and concussion. Your generosity in funding the vehicle was instrumental in saving the lives of all 3 Ukrainian soldiers. Now we are launching our Christmas Tree Trucks 2025 campaign. The goal is to raise €11,000. So please help us buy another vehicle for one of the most effective Ukrainian brigades on the fourth Christmas of Ukraine's epic fight for survival against an imperialistic and genocidal neighbouring state. Help us celebrate the heroism of the soldiers who have held the line against all the odds, who fight for their freedom and pay a terrible price, while also, incidentally, protecting the freedoms of Europe.
Yeah, well, that you and I have to be talking about this in 2025 is just so disheartening, frankly. The answer to Marxism was given within moments of the publication of the Communist Manifesto. I mean, the flaws of Marxism, and specifically the economic model of centralizing decision making and control, are patent. There's nothing. We shouldn't even be talking about this. And as Russia liberalized and established, you put your finger on the central single point, which is the rule of law, uh, rather than the rule of men or decree. Then efficiency will go up. Stalin knew this, but he refused to give up power. So his decision was, well, better that they all starve, literally, than that I not have control, because he was a sociopath and I think also sincere in his beliefs that the state had to control everything, and that understanding nothing about economics, that Marx must be right, and so on. But these issues have been resolved for let's see, 1848, so 179 years, if I do my math right, essentially, except that people, the truth is irrelevant to conviction. Take the specific issue of your current focus, and the one that should be for most of us, which is Ukraine. What the communism did through collectivization to Ukraine was so grotesque that the Ukrainians were reduced in desperation to welcoming effing Nazis as liberators. I mean, what a choice! What a choice! Uh, because 30 million of them, I think it was, or no, it's 8 million Ukrainians, um, were killed from communist policy. At a secondary, it's critical, but at a secondary level, uh, to me, the fundamental issue in Ukraine is Putin's determination, because he's a Russian nationalist and he believes in great Russia. It is the clash between Ukraine's definitive, it's clear, but this only in the last, for 2025, only in the last 20 years, perhaps. You would know better than I think. Turn and to the West, to Western norms, wholeheartedly to Western norms, and desire to have individual rights, rule of law, open society, to challenge authority as a basis of truth, be it at an individual level or up to the level of state power, all of which is antithetical to Russia's history. And Putin, understandably, doesn't want to see the near abroad become the West, which is Ukraine. And poor Poland, they're sort of the losers in history because they're stuck in the middle on flat land. If they were mountainous, they would have done a little better. They might have been Tito, but that's the clash. It's a very simple one, very simple one. And all of this, it's now FSB propaganda, but Russian conviction, sincerely, of many. Because if you hear a falsehood enough, it becomes the truth in your mind. That's not a facetious statement. That is literally the case. Oh, it's all true, and there are a couple of dynamics happening. One psychological, the social psychological, and the other cultural, which overlap from when you look at what Russians believed, the Russian officials believed, and then did in Ukraine. But this is just a good example. It's the truth pretty much everywhere, but every country. Uh, two things come to mind to help frame it. The Operation Ryan, few people have ever heard of. That was a KGB operation in the 1980s, early in my career. And actually, my career had nothing to do with it, except that chronologically, my career coincided. I began my career when Reagan was president, his first term. So the Russians listened to Reagan, denounced them as an evil empire, and then talk about tearing down walls and building up defense spending and significantly increasing what already had been an impressively increasing amount of aid by the United States to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the purpose being to kill as many Russians as possible for as long as possible, with great success, actually. And they thought, well, this is really a huge threat. And he's going to launch a first strike and kill us all to eliminate his enemy. And so the orders went out from the Kremlin, from the KGB, to all their residencies, all of their stations around the world, to report on anything that they could obtain, learn about American intentions to launch a first strike. Well, that's a legitimate and a responsible thing to do. You want to know if an enemy is going to attack you. And it's one of the first things I worked on when I was in training, actually. You don't want to be surprised. That's the point of intelligence service. So that is fine. But the way it was framed by the KGB was, this is going to happen. Look carefully for any sign that it will happen. It wasn't what is happening and report what you learn is happening. It was, this is what's going to happen. Please beware and look for it. So it was totally screwed up from the beginning. And you'd think that an equivalent to me off in the field would go, oh my God, these people are just lunatics. They've given the answer before they've asked the question. And that would be an insane thing for the United States to do. There's no way, you can just tell the Americans are going to launch a first strike. But no, you can't do that, because if you say that, you are then challenging orthodoxy, you're challenging your orders, and you're challenging the truth, and you will be destroyed. So the two things then happened. And the KGB officers, who were perhaps aware that it was cockamamie and surreal, nonetheless had to play within this Kafkaesque system. And so, with confirmation bias, they said, well, suspect CIA officer Glenn Carle bought a Russian novel, or who knows, something, and he's never shown interest in Russia before. Therefore, even non-specialist American intelligence officers are now turning their attention to long-term planning for the invasion. I mean, what? But that sort of thing happened more insidiously, but at the same time, people believe the framework of beliefs and perceptions, the paradigm of what is acceptable within their own tribe. Most people do. We all are on a bell curve and the standard deviation. And so lunacy might be here, but if your bell curve is over this way because the a prioris are all frightening, terrifying, then people actually believe it. And I saw this. Well, we all have lived this every day of our lives, but I saw this firsthand, horrifyingly, when the instruction came to my colleagues, who are almost, not without exception, but are principled, honorable, talented, trained professionals who, in an institution that is designed to doubt our information and to check our conclusions, never to accept anything. Nonetheless, as soon as the instruction came, is that the White House said we are to do the following, which was to torture, people saluted and said, oh, well, it's okay. By definition, we're the good guys, and we've been told that it's okay, so therefore it has to be okay. And they were sincere in this. So in the Russian side, the order came, the Americans are planning a first strike, we're afraid, so find evidence. So reports started to go in um, to the Kremlin saying, substantiating the American plan. And so the Soviet leadership became terrified that this was going to happen. They confirmed their fears. The second framework that is important to know with regard to Maidan and the Ukraine events as perceived by Vladimir Putin and the Russians, but in particular, Putin in particular, is that they're frames of what is acceptable and natural, just as you touched upon in your question, are different. And so Putin, I am convinced, sincerely believes that Hillary Clinton tried to overthrow him by using the CIA in a covert operation. Why? Because the Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America and you'll know them better than I, the various NGOs went to Russia and from the United Nations and the European Union to promote a free and fair election, which by definition, he said, well, you're out to get me. Well, probably he would have lost a free and fair election, Vladimir Putin. So therefore, what you're doing is hostile to me and is intentional. Well, we might have wanted to get rid of Putin, but our objective was to promote democracy. It's not the same thing. As far as he's concerned, it is. And so he is convinced that the United States sought to overthrow him. And then, as you will know better than I, at the same time, you have these two dynamics of perceiving Western actions from a zero-sum perspective, which is divorced from reality, Putin, and two, from the affirmation bias, confirmation bias, and framing of hostile intent from the outset by the KGB and Russian culture. The KGB gets the answer that it wants, that what is happening in Ukraine clearly is part of this large plot. Now, the other thing they I think quite accurately and consciously have perceived, certainly this is to me the driver of, well, pretty much everything that's happened in Ukraine for decades, but certainly in the last 15 years or 25, maybe 20 years, 25, is that Ukraine has culturally shifted. Its civilization has shifted, and polling shows this quite clearly. And so does economic. So does all the data you can consult. The trade levels have shifted towards the West. The study of English has increased. The appeal of Greater Russia has declined. Even, as I understand it, you'll probably know better than I, and correct me if I'm wrong, even among Russian Ukrainians, that was the truth prior to the war. And the shift to the west of Ukraine was patent, the desire of Ukrainians. Thus, the revolutions, the color revolutions, because they say, well, we want to be part of Europe, which means the EU and so on, rather than a subjugated, de facto subjugated little brother or tool of the Russian Imperium. And Putin is a great power, Machiavellian, found that unacceptable, because that would perpetually, forever end what had been hundreds of years of Russian Imperium. So that's how Putin sees what is this cultural shift as a CIA plot, one, and two, even if it is a cultural shift, I don't accept it because it harms Russia. And there, he's a realist power guy and doesn't care about the will of anybody other than what serves his definition of Moscow. Moscow's power. And so that's how they can see it as a nefarious action by my successors. whatever the norm is becomes the truth, because no one has time to, or the ability, no human does, to examine every question in human existence empirically and personally. So you accept it, you accept the paradigm. So fine. Um, all of this is I've half lost my train of thought, but this is the issue at play in Ukraine, and Putin is trying to make it stop. And he realized that he had lost the game. Sounds too lighthearted, facetious. He had lost the contest. Not he, Russia. The entire cultural construct and model and history had lost in Central Europe, because there's nothing more powerful and desired ultimately than for an individual to make his own decisions and to go his own way, which is the Western model. And so the alternative was he either loses, reforms, and then all can win, or he opposes and destroys and holds on. And he chose, of course, the latter. This is something which is shocking, and it's a remarkable testament to something about the Russian character or soul, if such a thing as soul exists, which is that there have been 1 million casualties in a population of 140 million. That's 70 million males, of whom probably, let's say 40 million of them are eligible in age and conditioning and so on to serve in the military. So that's 2.5% of the relevant male population of all Russia has now been destroyed, killed or destroyed, in this effort to hold on to the ancient Russian way in Central Europe. I also think in my experience, I don't know that I've met a Russian official, certainly was surprising to me, which I'll explain. Met or worked with a Russian official who accepted that the United States, in particular, or anyone from the West, from any other country, could act in any benign, mutually beneficial, or altruistic way whatsoever. That all of the talk about ideals and norms, rule of law, free and fair elections, market reform, currency reform, all of these things are literally parts of a strategic program to destroy Russia and eliminate any sort of rival that the United States would have. Jeffrey Sachs, the economist who either went or was sent early in the Clinton years to discuss market reform. Well, I think most people who have studied economics think that his advice was catastrophic. Catastrophic. It was a testament, it was a monument to his ego rather than to anybody's insight, and certainly not his, on how to reform market. He doesn't think so to this day, of course, but the Russians I dealt with would not accept that the intention in his going by the government of the United States was actually to do something right, and that everything was completely wrong from the American perspective, and the objectives that the U.S. government was seeking to attain. But they don't accept that whatsoever. That's just like us saying, well, we're protecting choose the next colonial state from chaos, when they would say, well, no, you just want to continue to be able to buy, extract the resources or whatever. They just do not accept it. And my surprise was when the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall fell, and I started to meet, as many American officials did, regularly, to work with our Russian counterparts. I thought, okay, the bear is no longer pushing everybody down, and we can now have rational discussions and move ahead. And I proved the stereotype of the American being a completely naive child, because that's not at all how just about any Russian I met was. The bureaucracies and the foreign ministry and the intelligence services were then, and quite clearly still are, utterly unreconstructed, completely unreconstructed. They are as defensive, aggressive, zero-sum oriented, hostile to the Western norms. They remain Russians, where the sophisticated West is a lure, and and is the serpent's poison. It's just unchanged, and I think that continues to drive much of what's happening in Ukraine and towards Donald Trump, the election, and Russian policy. Well, he may have been a low-level functionary. He wasn't in his career long enough to rise up, particularly. But I don't think that's really relevant. I mean, he's clearly bright, trained, and he is Russian. He is a Russian nationalist. He's a Russian patriot. He is a KGB officer. Russian culture is, because it realizes that the law has always been a pretense or a shroud over power, rather than the regulator of society and of power. So that makes him a classic Russian, highly intelligent and trained in a particular view, which I don't think is unique to the KGB. I think it's a Russian one, of international relations, which is cynical, and that one morals are a fool's design, and norms are a fool's design. It's all pure exercise of power in a zero-sum game, which is fundamentally different from the Western norm, which is that both sides can benefit by some sort of agreement. So I don't dismiss him or deride him or think he's unusual in viewpoints because of his background. I think he is more talented and ruthless than many, which is you don't rise to his position without having various skills, many of which are appalling, but that's what it requires in that system. And so that's how I see him. I don't see him as poor. I think here, let me tell one little point, which I think illustrates how he sees the world, how the intelligence service in Russia does, and how Russians can be sincerely deluded within their paradigm, as all of us are, as all of us are. So in 1983, it was during Reagan's first administration, the KGB initiated, and Reagan's talking about, I forget the exact terminology, Star Wars was an issue. We're going to, protect ourselves with this, missile defense system, and we're going to destroy the Soviet Empire. It's the evil empire, blah, blah, blah. And they initiated a large operation within the KGB to understand what was going on. It's called Operation Ryan. And the system is so twisted. No, R like Romeo, YAN. It's a Russian acronym. I don't speak Russian. Yeah. I could look up what it stands for. But Operation Ryan was to provide advance warning of when America was going to launch its first strike nuclear attack, which they believed was, if not imminent, sincerely being planned. Why did they believe this? Well, the ruling authorities were paranoid, and they said, we're afraid of this. Well, okay. And so therefore the KGB field officer like myself, my counterparts off in Dresden, where Putin was, or wherever the hell, said they aren't going to say, well, we have no evidence of this. And what are you talking about? Because if you do that, you end up in the gulag. And if you're great, you can write, a superb book, but more likely you will die. And so they start sending in reports, which of course are filtered to pander and please the master, because if you don't please the master, then you're by definition wrong in the system, and you'll be doomed. And I say it with a laugh, but it is twisted. This is Kurt Vonnegut. You laugh at the tragedy, but meanwhile, you're being firebombed if you don't kowtow. So they started sending these reports, all of which are confirming the presupposed conclusion. But everyone believed it. And the people who didn't thought, well, okay, maybe I'm insane because everyone else, what am I missing? And this is not this is true. And so the reports went on and on and on and on, and it became this circular reporting, and the Russians were terrified that Reagan was about to launch a nuclear strike, and they actually believed this. And so they then took measures to prepare for this, which is a sensible thing to do if you're about to be bombed with nuclear weapons, which the Americans picked up. And the Americans, my counterparts and the Americans went, "Oh my God, the Soviets are taking nuclear war steps," and things sort of escalated. And this was all an absolute delusion because of a perverse system that only accepted confirmation of propaganda derived assertions. It's sick, but it is also real, although completely fictional. Completely fictional. And so this is the world in which Putin operates. And anyone who's spoken to a Russian, or frankly, you could say the same thing about an American, except our delusions tend to be more benign, unless you're an Iraqi, say. Um, to summarize my response to your question, I don't find the fact that he was a functionary at a relatively low level significant. More significant is that he's a Russian nationalist, a Russian patriot, a trained KGB officer. His his view of international relations is zero sum, and he wants to retain and extend Russian influence as any government person working for a particular government should want to do. For 40 years, actually, I started to become aware of the dynamic, the dangers, the processes that you were touching upon early in my career. Yeah, try to give a concise answer. So early in my career, one of my assignments, one of the parts of my portfolio, we'll call it, the issues I was supposed to follow in my at that time was the far right in Europe. This is long before the fall of the Berlin Wall, so it's during the height or depths, however you want to describe it, of the Cold War. So I had to follow the far right. So okay, fine, fascinating. And I met with various far right activists and politicians in Europe, and one of them introduced me to, and he was a very intellectual fellow. He said, "Well, this is all coherent. We aren't. We're trying to make a better society, and there's a philosophically woven whole that we're trying to pursue. And you must read René Guénon. I'll show you. Well, no matter. I can pull the book down if you want, but listeners can't see the book. René Guénon, Guenon, was a philosopher from the early 20th century. He's Frenchman. And he's one of the fathers of a movement that is very little heard of or known. But I believe arguably the central driving cultural force in Western history of the past 125 years that goes a long way to explaining the rise of fascism and populism and hostility to the West by the East and hostility of, we'll call it radical Islam, to the West and colonialism. And it's called traditionalism. René Guénon said essentially, well, the modern world, and this will be familiar to many people, the modern world alienates the individual. René Descartes said this in the 17th century. He said there's no place on earth more lonely than a city because every man is alone and anonymous. That's a paraphrase, but Descartes said that. I read this when I was a grad student or a college student. I can't find the quote in Descartes any longer, but I know that he did say this. In any event, others have said it. So modernism, the modernization of the world, industrialization, the age of reason, the secularization of societies, alienate the individual from his organic self and his purpose here on earth, which has to be harmony with the world around him and focus on inner contentment as opposed to material gain. A lot of people identify with much of that. Who doesn't, actually? And so it became a hostile. His view was that uh, we're turning into all civilizations and every individual into a nihilist, and we're committing suicide, even if we are still alive, through modernization. So we must reject this now by returning to traditional norms, which is, in the Russian context, the Orthodox Church, and there's no separation of the individual with the group, with the higher system of beliefs that don't just define but regulate all one's existence and of one's relation to the state and to any modern world. So change, progress, individual reason, secularism, all of these things are part of the devil's work, truly. This appeals to a lot of people who has not felt alienated, particularly as one gets older, by the rapidity of social change and the arc of personal life. So Guénon talked about this, and that explained this politician I was talking to why he was supporting the far right, which wanted to eliminate the foreigner and the immigrant as culturally polluting and destructive, eliminate the secular humanists as part of the Antichrist in some ways, they believe literally, but certainly as subversive and dangerous to a, um, a successful, happy life. And that drove their politics. So I thought, well, that's interesting, but that's pretty abstruse and strange. And that was 40 years ago. And so, okay. However, then a decade later, I my it was in different assignments, and I started to work on terrorist related issues. And I wasn't a Middle Eastern specialist. I'm a European specialist. That's what my degrees are in European studies and economics, and I lived and studied in Europe and so on. That's the focus of my life. But everyone in the CIA turned to terrorism, unsurprisingly, after 9/11, and I did several years before. So I started to meet with terrorists, not just to interrogate them, but as my work to try to identify them, understand them, and find their causes and so on. And it turns out, shockingly at the time to me, that there are explicit connections between the driving individuals of what has become a thumbnail term characterized as radical Islam from uh, from the colonial period up through the early 70s, with the major traditionalist thinkers at the time who had become Italians. Then they were the fathers of Mussolini's fascism and then of German fascism and Nazism, because it's a rejection of colonialism, which means the West, of secularism, which means the West, of the West because it is not the East or the Orient. And they were intellectually not just in tune, but they actually knew each other. And I think now my memory is failing me a little bit, but some prominent, to the extent they are prominent, thinkers in traditionalist thought, including Guénon, this is 110 years ago or 100 years ago, converted to Islam because it's more organically holistic, cogent view about how to interpret man's place in the universe. You don't have to deal with the complexity of a trinity and the intermediary of an ecclesiastic hierarchy, blah, 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 blah. So not just the affinities, but the explicit links are quite close. Similarly, this is true with Russian Orthodoxy, which has basically defined itself as a way for Russians to survive the hordes from the East and the insidious poisonings from the West. Well, it's also pre-modern because only the western end of Europe, this little end of the Eurasian landmass, ever has experienced organically the, call it 500 years, but maybe 700 years of the Renaissance, Reformation, Age of Reason, Age of Enlightenment, and so on. All of those perspectives, beliefs, logical progressions are imports to Moscow or to Cairo. They're not organically emergent from the culture's own evolution. Whereas, the French killed themselves by, a third of the population, the Germans, a third of the population, the British for 100 years. We were all massacring one another over these questions in simply put, our religious wars, which were a response to changes coming from the Renaissance and then the Reformation. So it's an import, as my KGB friends always have said, and as I just described it in the Ukrainian context, rather than an organic one. But this traditionalist movement is a coherent, real phenomenon with a corpus of work and reference points that people try to follow, even when the politicians, and many of them are Americans now, have no idea whatsoever what I would be I'm talking about, or about the word itself, traditionalist. Yeah, no, I don't think it's simplistic at all. I would say that it's describes the essentials of the dynamic as I understand it. And I think I don't think there's any reasonable challenge to this description of events. One can't separate the Russian oligarchs, the Russian quote mafia unquote, and the Russian intelligence services. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was not quite a state of nature, but there was chaos. And then there was privatization done, I think, very poorly. It's easy to criticize privatizing a centralized economy. It's one of the hardest things possibly to do on earth is to do it successfully without vast corruption. But whether that's true or not, there was, and so who continued to influence, if not hold, the levers of power? It was the security state, which is the KGB and the FSB and GRU and on and on. And so who took advantage of these things, but the ruthless people who were willing to kill and knew how to wield power. And they're the ones I just mentioned, in addition to murderous thugs. I couldn't do it. I'm a goody two-shoes who reads books and stops at traffic lights. And, I would have been quickly fed to the cats. But they are ruthless killers and dynamic, talented individuals, many of them. And so there is this marriage of these overlapping sets. There's no question about that. And Putin came to the top of the heap in that, and that defines the state. You do not have oligarchs sending $100 million themselves and all of their escorts to London without the overview of manipulation by the Russian state and Russian intelligence service or anywhere else. Absolutely certain. I saw firsthand in 1994. I was in Geneva. I was living in Europe, and you could literally see the Russian, the new rich, the Russian oligarchs walking on the streets of Geneva with briefcase in one hand and the rental escort female of the moment on the other, going to the Swiss banks with their literally ill-gotten gains. And if one so much as raised an eyebrow at them, you died. And so that defines the state, yes. Yeah, I think they're both too simplistic, and something that I think that almost everyone, and I would include even intelligence officers, but much less, um, misunderstands or misses is that all of the above can be simultaneously true and false. And I think that is the case. Um, one imagines, the average layman will imagine, okay, one's a spy, one's not a spy. But that's not really how it works. Sometimes it does. Sometimes I could say, uh, Mr. Fink, will you spy for the United States? And you say, oh, yes. And I say, okay, well, sign right here. And now you're a spy. Okay, that happens. Um, More often, all of us are contradictory, and all of us operate at multiple levels of conviction and sincerity with respect to the infinite number of issues to which we react in our lives. And so I can simultaneously be an American patriot and work to undermine my country. I can believe, choose whatever else you want to believe in. I can believe in God and think that it's all nonsense simultaneously. We are not coherent, consistent, uniform beings. And that's how intelligence works. So the Russians are superb at this. I think they're superior to the Americans and even the British. I think the British are more devious in some ways than the Americans. Um, in that, you can say, "Oh, Glenn, here's what I want you to do, and here's why, and here's how it will help you." And I'll go, "Oh yeah, okay, fine." And at the same time, maybe they will at the same time they will be taking steps to destroy me, at least potentially, have the lever ready to turn the switch to destroy me, although I'm working sincerely for them, or they will initiate operations or disinformation or actions that will counter exactly what they're having me do. So an example is the Russians have simultaneously uh, fostered uh, social tensions with regard to race relations in the United States. At the same time that they are supporting white supremacists and black civil rights leaders. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Of course, it makes perfect sense because the point is not to advance black rights or white supremacy. The point is to put people at odds with each other, to make them not understand what's happening, for them to feel tension, distrust, grievance, and to be potentially more manipulable, whatever the word is, and then you have achieved your objective. And you do that with an individual too, such as Donald Trump, or Glenn Carle. It doesn't matter. Uh, you will exploit them for certain purposes and undermine them for others simultaneously. Now, someone I was expecting you to mention, because you touched upon, I think this is your work, if not your life's work, certainly important to it. I think one of the um, overlooked significant figures in the 21st century, if not beyond that, is Vladimir Putin's former vice premier, whatever his title was. Vladimir, I think is his first name, Surkov,
Surkov, I was about
who
to say. Vladislav Surkov, yeah.
Vladislav Surkov, who to me is the architect of what is destroying the world. Actually, I mean, he's a seminal genius. Unfortunately,
Yes, he hasn't gone into retirement, but decided to take a slightly lower profile. I'm fascinated
and
to hear
he's
what you think.
unanimous grise, or what his function is actually, I think, now irrelevant because his approach has been so profoundly incorporated into the foreign policy and the intelligence policy and the governmental policy and the specific paradigm and approach of Vladimir Putin, that whether he's alive or dead is now secondary. Marx is dead, but Marx defines still a lot, and the same with Surkov. And for people who few people will even know who this man is, but he essentially took marketing techniques and propaganda techniques, which are as old as time,
And postmodern
and distilled them.
theatre.
I have railed against postmodernism for all my adult life. You're touching a sensitive button here with me. Um, there is truth. Our senses do perceive objective reality. And to destroy it because saying everything is relative and only comes out of our own heads will turn us into nihilists or Vladimir Putin. Um, but okay, we'll put philosophy and sociology aside for just a moment, a little. But Surkov's objective is to so distort people's perceptions that truth becomes impossible to identify. That sounds ludicrous, but I'm completely serious. And that empowers the state because then, and I mentioned this point earlier, it has been empirically shown that a statement repeated sufficiently becomes one's perceived reality, therefore the truth. And that allows the state to say, well, even though, let's say, Ukrainians are starving because of collectivization, I can say, we're all marching towards a happier future. Look, the sun is rising. And if you repeat this endlessly, many people will believe it until the moment they expire from starvation. And I'm not being, I'm exaggerating a bit for effect, but not fundamentally. And taking that sounds, well, what does that have to do with international relations? What it has to do with is the projection of Russian state power in this instance. And who is the great opponent? That's the United States. How does one go after, challenge the United States? Well, you can try to build MiG fighter jets that are the equal of F-22s, but better is to undermine the foundations of American coherency and power. And that is social cohesion, belief in democracy, belief in the rule of law, faith in institutions, and you undermine that by supporting white nationalists and civil rights activists simultaneously, and having individuals say things that are at cross purposes to reality. And then you end up with the America of today.
A lot cheaper
And
as well.
that is the explicit uh, strategy of Russian intelligence services, the Russian government, and has been the Russians are the best at this and have been since the Soviet Revolution and even before, because the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the greatest disinformation campaign in history, was the Russian intelligence service that wrote it. Um, so they're just wonderful at doing this, but this has been distilled and modernized by Vladislav Surkov into a state policy. And over 25 years, and the Russians are better at long-term projects than the Americans. This has reaped, we are now reaping dramatic success and consequences from this sustained operation understates strategy. Absolutely true. It was imposed from on high, which then did alter the culture some, but nonetheless it was a top-down phenomenon rather than an organic one. I would describe the same point, I think, just from slightly different things you're talking about a moment ago. I think you mentioned literature. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, I thought, okay, I need to educate myself a little bit on the culture here. So I decided finally to read Gogol. And I read Taras Bulba. And I'd all my life heard about what a magnificent writer Gogol is. And I understand that Taras Bulba is not representative of his most subtle work. Okay, fine. Nonetheless, um, the contrast to me just jumped out, and I think is valid, between the world as one sees it through reading Taras Bulba and Gogol or Dostoevsky or Tolstoy even, compared to that of Herman Melville and Moby Dick, or Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn, for example. What do Twain and Melville say? How do they see the world? It's Huckleberry Finn really is a story of one hopes, moral aspiration, if not redemption. The only pure soul on the entire story is the slave Jim. He's the hero of the tale, although he remains a slave and terribly treated. But the point that I'm raising is not that. It's rather that it's of an individual acting upon society, his responsibility. How does he find agency in his society? And Herman Melville is basically Melville himself characterized Moby Dick as an overlong sermon. And I'm from New England, and Melville was from New England, and boy oh boy, this is the Calvinist Puritan ethic for 700 pages, where you are responsible for your fate, even though you're doomed. You nonetheless, it's the man alone against the universe, responsible for finding a way. That is the job. It is the individual is the center of the whole framework, the whole perception, the whole paradigm of life. Taras Bulba is one nationalist, almost screed is a little unfair to say, but the whole point of view of Taras Bulba is to exalt the supremacy and the martial order and the imperialist drive and obligation of, you can argue, Ukrainian, Russian, of the Slav against themselves and against the other. And then Dostoevsky is struggling massively, hugely influenced me, and I admire him a lot. The individual wrestling with fate, but it's a helpless individual who is dealing with a Kafkaesque state that no one can do anything about. And so your freedom is only to deny and to avoid, rather than to become part of and to transform in any sort of Whiggish arc of progress. It's an utterly different way of placing the individual in society. And I don't think it's changed an iota in 150 years. I think that's very much what's happening, although I would characterize it, I guess, or frame it, is a word I've been using recently, a little differently. What we attribute to the communist mentality, I think really communism is an organic evolution out of the cultural perspective that you described, or that I've been trying to describe, which is that of a peasant, pre-industrial, hierarchical society where individuals have no agency, and life is a zero-sum game. So if I can't rise up, so I have to bring my opponent down, otherwise I'll be destroyed. I think that's what's happening now in the West. Why? Because we have seen since 1980, from 1980, with the election of Reagan and Thatcher, a shift in the post-world socioeconomic order. And from 1945 until 1980, in the West, there was a redistribution of income to some extent. Now, the rich remained very rich, and the poor far more numerous than the rich, of course. But there had been a redistribution, and for the first time in almost first time in history, there had been a significant redistribution, so that you had true increase in living standards and agency of the little man in society. Now, this came from the cataclysm of the war and from redistributive policies that emerged from the Depression and from the war. However, that all changed with the triumphs of the neoconservatives, or whatever we wish to call them, as embodied by Thatcher and Reagan. And this is not well, you do get to a value assessment, but it's an objective data exposition, not an attack on a political level. The concentration of wealth started to reverse from 1980, and the rich came to have more, and the poor came to have less. So that now you have, I think the figure is some shocking thing like 90% of all the wealth in the United States is held by 1% of the population, or maybe it's the top 10%. And the bottom 80% of the population holds 10% of the wealth. The concentration of wealth is greater than that of the Gilded Age of the, say, 1900, or of the Roman Empire. Uh, so that makes people a little upset when their living standards are being threatened. Now, the standard of living has slowly improved per capita income in the United States or in the West, but it has largely coincided with the increase in two-income families as females have entered the workforce, which I'm happy to say, affirm, I think is a wonderful thing. I want any individual to do whatever he, she, or whomever wishes, but it now takes two incomes to have the same standard of living, broadly speaking, that it took one income to provide 60 years ago when I was a boy. At the same time, you have globalization, another thing that I am a champion of, and free trade, where you do have um, people over the horizon making decisions about your life that you can do nothing about. So at least from the US, one of the stereotypical stories about why Brexit succeeded was because the English didn't want to drink demi-liter. They wanted to drink a pint. And God damn it, no one in Brussels is going to tell me how much beer I can drink. Well, I'm afraid so, or my house should be painted by an Englishman instead of some sort of Pole. That's it. That's it. And in America, you have now Beijing or Brussels or who knows making decisions that have affected me at the same time that the middle class, the lower middle class, really the working class that could afford a home and a car and take the family to the movies on the weekend can't really do that now. And then the deepest phenomenon, of course, is that if people don't look like you, they aren't you. And America was 89% white when I was born, and today it's probably 52% white. And in the next, I don't know, year, 7 years, something, who knows, it will be a majority minority society. This provides all sorts of wonderful things culturally, if one is open to them. But if one has lost one's job at the factory, can't understand what the people making the decisions are saying, and they look different from you, then the other is to blame. And so you then have the rise of the populist right. And this is why the same phenomenon is occurring in France and Holland and Germany and Italy and Great Britain and the United States, because of the loss of relative living standards, the concentration of wealth, the loss of agency in economic and social terms, and the loss of status as the defining cultural and racial element of a given society. So you have packies running around in England, and you have people who don't speak English in America, and everyone gets angry about that. And that plays into the exact narrative of this traditionalist phenomenon, which is the Russian reaction to Western incursions, and why the KGB operations in the West can have such resonance. Without question, absolutely. I tried to just say that it is occurring. But let's use, like all American intelligence officers, I was focused on terrorism for many years. That became my thing more than the Russians. I became a terrorist person. But let's take some terminology from our good friend Osama bin Laden. Or actually, it was one of his mentors, but no matter. And so the United States is the head of the snake, or the great Satan, or both. But there are little Satans, and there are other snakes, or the body of the snake. So the number one target is the United States, but it's not the only target at all. Not at all. No. Europe is directly has been targeted for decades in the same ways, in absolutely the same ways. Now, this extends or encompasses the kind of operation that people would understand if they heard of it, such as at minimum 2 attempts by the Russian intelligence services to assassinate the prime minister of Montenegro, 2 the Russian operations, conceivably Ukrainian, but I really believe it's Russian, to severing cables in the North Sea, 2 any number of quote think tanks and forums, if we want to use the bastardized contemporary English, in France, which is my specialty. I know I lived in France for many years and studied in French schools and so on. So that's where my attention tends to default. But that's the only reason France I single out, because it's equally true for Great Britain or for Germany, et cetera, where these think tanks are friendship societies or international affairs study groups or journalists associations, all of which get together and present viewpoints that don't directly contradict the United States, but that raise concerns. Well, isn't it unfair? That's even too strong a term. Wouldn't it be good were France to have a national defense independent of that of the hegemon? And I put that in actually crude terms compared to how they do it. They're much more sophisticated than that. And so then one thinks, well, of course, I love France or I love Germany, and so why should Washington, when these people who are overweight and eat bad food, tell me what to do? Well, sure. And all of a sudden, then the threads that bind Europe to the United States start to loosen a little bit, and this is a long-term project, and that's happening all over the place, from literal assassinations to the level of shaping acceptable discourse or raising different points of view. And of course, one wants to have different points of view, but if they're directed towards undermining, that's a different story. And that's the stuff of the essence of the Russian strategy. Now, the intelligence services methods are tactics, but the strategy is absolutely clear. Well, the ultimate strategic objective is the deconstruction of a superpower. As I said, that's absolutely true. It's not true. So it is true that the Russians, say my counterpart, would say, "Oh, what a good idea it would be to support and isolationists in the United States, for example, or little government advocates." That adduces to Russian national, helps Russian national interests. But the people who are isolationists or little government conservatives are completely sincere and are completely patriotic. And this is how one can objectively be a tool of Russian intelligence in this instance, and yet a totally sincere patriot at the same time, who is hostile to Russia and loves America. So that is true. But it's also true and important, and I think that the driving force is that the Doge element or effort that you cited as our specific example right now is a sincere effort, and that comes from a whole different couple of strains of political philosophy and political culture in the United States and in the West. And that is one, there have always been small government conservatives, that's fine, or people who want to deregulate. But this movement is not originated by the Russians, although exploited by. Of course, you exploit anything you can exploit. One of my classmates in college at Harvard 50 years ago, not a friend, but we were both government majors, or we were reading government, which in other American universities is called political science, has devoted his life, and he's one of the unknown, just like Vladislav Surkov. This is one of the unknown powers or influencers of our lifetimes, named Grover Norquist, and his objective, and not only his, but he's been central to it, He's devoted his life to changing the American government in two ways. One, he thinks that government only, the national government of the United States only has two functions, literally two: national defense, that means the military, and border control. That's it. And otherwise, his objective is to reduce the size in absolute terms of personnel and budget of the central government, the federal government of the United States, by 50%. That's the basis of the now dominant wing of the Republican Party that gives us Doge. The other is Project 2025, which is the current incarnation of the second strain, and that is the conviction that the American government is inefficient, and it is by design, by intent, inefficient. The explicit decision being that it is better to be inefficient, to separate powers rather than allow them to concentrate, because that can lead to tyranny. Now, you can say, I think it's pretty clear that a separation of powers, decentralized federal system, in many ways is less efficient than the CCP of Beijing, or the thug state of Vladimir Putin. They don't have to worry about the law. They can simply seize land and direct resources as they wish. And that leads to many efficiencies and advantages. It also leads to structural disadvantages and so on. But okay. So the feeling is it's inefficient, yet America is the great power on earth. And we are not designed to effect a foreign policy in any coherent, effective, sustained way that can perennialize American hegemony and maximize American strength. We must do something about this. And so let's centralize power. And this is called the unitary theory of executive power, which is we have to stop essentially all of this separation of powers, the three co-equal branches of government and so on, bring it all together in the executive so that he can act. And that's quite coherent, and maybe it's correct, but it is also literally revolutionary in American terms. So if Americans decide they want to have that system of government, I will oppose it. But if that's how the process evolves so that becomes the government, that okay, that's a coherent, rational decision and one that can be in conformity with the rule of law and the Constitution. But that's not how it's playing out, of course. So the effort is to centralize power. Now, where does that theory come from? I love saying this because it sounds so outlandish and no one believes it, but it's literally true. The philosopher of this unitary theory of executive power, just like we look to Marx and Lenin and Mao as the fathers of communism, Steve Bannon is a disciple. It's a man named Carl Schmidt, who was an eminent jurist. And where was he an eminent jurist? He was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer. And, he was a highly respected and well-regarded, brilliant lawyer and thinker in then still Weimar Germany, although he was one of the masters of its destruction. And he justified Kristallnacht. He was the one who wrote the brief for Kristallnacht, and on and on and on. And you can say, well, the fact that he did that doesn't undermine the coherency and the necessity and the rightness of his philosophy on governmental structures. Well, possibly. I personally would be wary of basing the American system of government on one of the chief thinkers of Nazism, but that's where it comes from. So those are the two threads that are independent of the Russian intelligence operations, but that the Russians are happy to support because both not so much the Carl Schmitt centralizing of power, they wouldn't like that so much, but those are separate, profound and critical strains in what's happening in America and frankly in the West. And that at the same time, it's not only America that's going insane. And why is that? That's a whole other subject that gets us back to the roots of Vladimir Putin's thought, which is frankly traditionalism, which is this change destabilizes, rise of individual rights, ergo of democratic norms, be it at an individual or societal, governmental level, undermine authority and power and what is right, as in with a capital R, I guess. And all of this is to be opposed. This is what Dostoevsky writes about. And this is the soul of Russia, to oppose the perverse West and modernism. And it's profoundly laced into the deep conservative movements throughout Europe and the United States. The French right bases itself upon a thinker named René Guénon. He's a traditionalist. He derives his basis of his thought in his opposition to the West. Islamic jihadists are the same. In fact, the far right in Europe has profound associations with jihadist Islam, because both of them reject Western norms, which are decadent, that dismiss Allah or God or the church or the Kremlin, or the way things used to be in America before America got it wrong. And all of them are deeply associated. When I talk about this, people think that I'm some sort of a loon, because how can you bring Osama bin Laden, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump together coherently? But they
No.
Well, no, Trump doesn't have a coherent philosophy himself. He doesn't care about these things at all. He was pro-abortion until he decided it was politically useful for him to be anti-abortion. So that doesn't matter. He is, in that sense, a weather vane, but quite attuned to what will help him collect and maintain power and influence. However, there are very coherent thinkers doing precisely what you said in an organized, intentional, and well thought out way. So let's see, this is 2025, 21 or 2 years ago. I first became, well, no. I have to go back much further. When I was a college student, I majored in government, which meant I read political philosophy, I think one would say in the English context, and or political science, whatever one says. So one of my classmates, and I knew him, but we were not good friends. I don't know that he would remember me from then, probably not. Was a fellow named Grover Norquist. We literally were classmates in the government department as undergraduates at Harvard in the 1970s. And he was a pleasant fellow and not taken very seriously. Harvard tended, 4 out of 5 Harvard students vote Democratic, 1 out of 5 vote Republican. He was a Republican, so he was an outlier, which is fine. So was my roommate. But he had then explicitly, he was open about this. He was a libertarian and a small government conservative, fine. He thought that the government was bloated and shouldn't be telling people how to live in almost any way. And so he set as his goal, he said, the American government, which means the federal government, well, actually all levels of government, should be 50% smaller, one half the size that it was then or it is today, and only had 2 legitimate functions, only 2. One was national defense, which meant the military, and 2 was border security. This is not ex post facto projecting backward. These were the explicit objectives and philosophy of my classmate, Grover Norquist. So what happened in our lives? I went on to become a classic civil servant, serving the state, an internationalist, a realist, and I think and a moderate and in domestic policy. Fine. He went on to become involved in Republican politics and had every Wednesday. I think the name of the meeting was the Wednesday morning group of a small number of prominent Republicans in Washington who would meet Wednesday mornings to discuss how we can succeed, have the Republicans succeed electorally and politically and in policy terms, and what are our objectives. And they are to reduce the size of government by 50% so that it only has 2 functions. Jump ahead now to our time in the election of Donald Trump. Now, who are the ideological, philosophical, coherent strategists and thinkers of the Republican Party and of the Trump administration. It's the authors from in the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, particularly Heritage, of this project we all have heard of, Project 2025. And what is the objective of Project 2025? It is to reduce the size of the government. They will start at 25%, but the objective is 50%. And the objective is that government has only two functions. And what are they? To have a strong military and border security. Now, you add on to that, so it's a very coherent policy. Now, I became aware of this in policy terms. I always thought that we thought he was a gadfly and sort of laughable. The joke is on us. Early in the war on terror, when I started to become involved in the enhanced interrogation program, and the justification of the neoconservatives was the unitary theory of executive power. That's the third pillar. That's actually the philosophical and policy pillar of the Project 2025. What is the unitary theory of executive power, or the theory of unitary executive power? The belief is that the American system of government is inefficient and inappropriately designed for a great power, and for America to implement and succeed in its policies internationally, or for that matter, domestically, but certainly internationally. But that's a coherent argument, and it's probably true. The American system is designed by intent to be inefficient. The intention being that a balance of powers, a separation of powers, is better than a concentration of power, because that's the way to avoid tyranny, or the tyranny of the majority. It's the ultimate anti-fascist philosophy. And it has succeeded to the point where the government in America frequently are paralyzed and incoherent. That is true. So their view, the unitary theory of executive power people, is that that's just not acceptable. We have to bring all executive authority into the White House, into the executive control, so that we can have effective policies. Well, that's a legitimate position to have, but it is also, in the American context, literally revolutionary. So maybe we should have a revolution. Maybe we should change all these things. But if you change them, it's either a revolution or it's a putsch, legally or illegally. That's by definition what those changes would be: an utter change in the American system of government. And so what is the Project 2025 doing? Exactly what I said. Now, in the war of terror, to justify unitary theory, I forgot, to justify unitary theory of executive power, I read, they say, well, as their reference, the thinker that the Republicans would cite then to justify enhanced interrogation and the gathering together of power in the executive branch was the prominent thinker named Carl Schmidt, who said blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. You think, well, okay, well, who's Carl Schmidt? Carl Schmidt was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer, who was the lawyer that justified, quote, legally, unquote, Kristallnacht and the putsch of the Nazi Nazi party to assume power. Why did they do that? Because the state, by definition, was a deep state, which is hostile to the desires and the needs and the well-being of the masses. And the only way that the masses can find redress and to be represented is from, quote, the leader, one man, as opposed to the state, against the state, bypassing and subverting it, assuming all power for himself. So you have this marriage of Carl Schmitt's fascist views, the traditionalist views, which are identical, with their sociological views, with the explicit political objectives of my classmate, who's one of the major figures, totally unknown, relatively speaking, in recent American history, Grover Norquist, whose intent is to eliminate all functions of the government except for two. And that's why we're living the moment we're living. Other than to sigh and dismay, I guess that's not an effective response, really, either here on the podcast or in life. But these are very coherent rationales and forces, and powerful. And I think we get to another phenomenon that makes it very hard to contest them. And it's something I touched upon a little bit a short while ago. and it is with regard to the KGB and the Russians, but also with any society. People believe their leaders, and the truth becomes what your tribe says it is. And so you have half of America, or 40%, who almost all of whom are admirable people. They're normal people who wish the well for their families and not to be unfair to anybody, who uh, reflexively and sincerely accept the framing of their leaders, which really in this instance means Donald Trump, that the solutions to our multiple social, political, economic challenges is to break all to China. This was, I don't know if that was a good choice of term, um, and to demonize your opponent. This is what essentially this is the dilemma for any culture, but we're talking about Russian culture, and I touched upon Islam. Any culture that is confronted by a more dynamic, more powerful culture. The option, the choice is I evolve and I embrace, or I oppose. If I reform and embrace, then I no longer am who I am. And because by definition I have the truth, the great Russian soul, we are here on earth as the purity of God's will and national purpose and essence of being. And so if we don't remain true to that, we are betraying who we are and the whole point of existence.
And you deconstruct
So
your
that means,
economic model. You have to
yeah,
deconstruct your vertical of power, which controls resources, and your story is built to justify your
that's right.
control of yeah.
And your soul. It's a betrayal of everything that has made you what you are, and who wants to be a traitor and lose what they are? So the alternative is you oppose. Now, where we this plays out in every cultural clash between the more dynamic society and the more traditional one, thus traditionalism, in human history. What's the story of the American Indian? Now, it's contemporarily obligatory to say that, of course, their society was as pure at the very least as the West, this rapacious West and so on. And there's truth to that, of course. But the fact is that a bow and arrow is less lethal than gunpowder, and thus, they were doomed. That's it. And they had a choice. If we embrace the more powerful society, we are destroyed. If we oppose them, we will be destroyed. Better to oppose them and remain who we are than to surrender and lose our essence before we lose our existence. It's the same story with regard to Islam. It's the same story, and it has been for at least 500 years with regard to Russia. Russia is a hybrid because it, partially embraced and partially resisted, but ultimately, they want to define themselves as not the West. And so there's sort of this fatal doom culturally in their perspective that we must either destroy or be destroyed. Well, there's, I don't know if you know the name Von Meter. It turns out Von Meter, he was a comedian during President Kennedy's administration. So this is now 60 years ago. He happened to be recently learned from my hometown, which is which is Brookline, Massachusetts. My father actually knew the Kennedys as a little boy, which are other stories. So that's why this comedian could do the Kennedy accent so well, because it was his own accent. And in his most famous recording at the time, it was a national bestseller in 1962. He told a joke, and President Kennedy was meeting with Premier Khrushchev and Charles de Gaulle for some summit, and they take a break. It's lunchtime, and so Kennedy's the host. So of course, as an American, they order sandwiches instead of some sort of a state dinner. And Kennedy says, I'll simplify a little bit. Kennedy says, "Well, I'll have a Western sandwich," and I don't know if a Western sandwich is known in England. or elsewhere, a Western sandwich is a kind of sandwich. I don't even know what's in it, but it has lettuce and tomato. Who knows what? It's a kind of sandwich, like a bologna sandwich or something. So Kennedy says, I will have a Western sandwich. I could even do the accent, but I won't. And so Khrushchev listens to this and he says, well, then I will have the eastern half of the Western sandwich. Well, that's it. There, humor distills truth, and that's the Russian resentment and inferiority. Absolutely, that's the critical point. I'm glad you said it. We are two tines of a tuning fork. It's irrelevant whether he is actually a direct Russian asset, or if he's a fellow traveler, or simply an individual being manipulated. And certainly the latter is the case. The former two definitions, I think, have been in various degrees. But I go back to one of the early points I made. One should not think of an intelligence operative, an asset, as American CIA officers call them, or a spy, as the layman would say, in a binary way. I won't talk about my operations, but I can characterize a little of the nature of the work, which is that you take what you can get and you use what is useful, and then ignore the rest. And you realize that you can't have everything, and someone will work at cross purposes to your objectives and national interests many times. But if you can get them to do something, then that is a success. And it needn't be sign on the dotted line, yes, I will be a pure spy and only do things in the benefit of, in this instance, Russia. So, and anyone in a public role, well, not even a public role, cannot act in a way that is so alerting that they say, well, oh my God, this person has to be a Russian spy, because the person is anything from a CIA officer to a congressperson to a president. And so that's pretty alarming. So you do things that aren't alarming. And often, and besides, you are a patriot and you love your country anyway, even if you're spying against it. This is something that one has to understand. And so I will do things that I think are good for my country. At the same time, my other hand is out receiving, X dollars a month so that I do things that I'm requested to do by a foreign intelligence service. So all of the above, and yes, the fundamental point you make is that it's a red herring to worry too much about definitions. I've often thought, well, what's the greatest of anything? There's no greatest of anything. There's so many, who's the most beautiful woman in the world? I mean, what a stupid thing. There are an infinite number of beautiful women in the world. There are an infinite number of remarkable intelligence operations. However, the British intelligence service, to me, had one of the great successes in intelligence history in let's say from 1933, certainly from 36 to December 7, 1941, in manipulating the American political system to support Great Britain and to enter the war, to the point that there's strong evidence that no one ever talks about, that the British intelligence service selected the Republican candidate for president in 1940 so that he would be in supportive of America supporting Great Britain and entering the war, and destroying anyone who thought that England was a rapacious imperial nation, and so much the better that they get it taken to them because they're all imperialist rats. And those people, the British brilliantly destroyed over and over and over and over again. About 50, do you think in miles or kilometers? No matter. 15 kilometers, 10 miles from my house here, that direction, was a radio station. I forget the call signs in the 1930s and 1940s. That was a British intelligence operation. It was an American station broadcasting to the United States, but also with the power of a signal, broadcasting even overseas. And the thing was a pure product of British intelligence. That's just one example of an infinite number. So, of course, all these levels of manipulation that can seem contradictory and incoherent uh, can be part of a larger strategic operation. And that's certainly what the Russians have been doing for decades. I have to give another example. So the British wanted the United States to enter the war, and how you have to have the president needs support, and the President Roosevelt wanted, as is well known, he was far more forward leaning, and to use an expression, than the American public. And so some of the things he was aware of and thought, well, good, because it helps me, even if he knew that it was British manipulation and disinformation, and other things he didn't know about. So one of the big issues in 1940 was, oh my God, the Nazis are going to seize the Panama Canal, or the Japanese are going to seize the Panama Canal, and this will be catastrophic for American interests. And what about the Monroe Doctrine? And this is terrible. We can't possibly allow this to happen. These German operatives are everywhere, and we have to do something about it. And so the FBI is sent down to Latin America and does a lot of good things. And then President Roosevelt himself gave a press conference, and he showed a famous map of here's where we have found the German operations in Panama and Colombia, and they've some of which was true, But the map, all of this was an explicit British intelligence operation to convince Roosevelt and the American public that the Nazis had to be opposed because it harmed American interests and not just, this besieged imperial, dying, island someplace. And Roosevelt never knew that this was the British intelligence service who ginned the entire thing up. There should be, yes, I would argue, but that's destabilization, covert action operations are profoundly sensitive and problematic, and almost without exception, they have unintended consequences that are harmful to the country that does them. Not always, but almost always. What has alarmed me is, and I can't prove this, and I've been out of the service for years, and even if I had classified information, of course, I couldn't share it. But I believe that the Russian intelligence service has assassinated something like 49 individuals in Great Britain in the last 20 years. Yeah, I think the numbers will have gone up. And the amount of oligarch money is not definitive for the city, for London's financial center, but deeply influential on the British political system and policies. And it appears that the money is so helpful, this is a terrible thing to say, or the service is so daunting, as in Russian service, that the British have, in a number of ways, turned a blind eye for decades to this situation, which I find shocking, because the British are as courageous as anyone, at least, and their intelligence service is superb, with many flaws. But that's life. That's human nature. So I have been mystified at the seeming passivity for decades. That's not as true for the United States, but that the United States has been manipulated and so on. Of course, that's certainly true. But that's a shock to me. Well, at least quasi-authoritarianism, we're seeing that already. Certainly, the polls have shown for years and years that 40% of the American public considers democracy irrelevant and prefers to have, quote, efficiency and someone who can get things done, and authoritarian. America's a profoundly democratic society. This is the frustration for Europeans: is how can such a disorganized cacophony make any sense or have any pretense to leadership when you don't dress right, you don't eat right, and you contradict authority figures and don't know what you're talking about. All of which is true, but all of which is the essence of the American genius and success simultaneously. Totalitarians have for 250 years underestimated democracies because they seem incoherent. And yet they can marshal, when they manage to, a greater force than an authoritarian state. That's been true up until now. We'll see if that's true with regard to China. So Trump, of course, that's his base, and himself is, all of the things we've been talking about are not just irrelevant; they're beyond his conceptual framework or interests. It's all irrelevant. It's all, life is zero sum. Life is about power, and life is about him. He loves his country because that's where the country he's from. So he likes wrestling and Madison Square Garden and baseball, and he's an American. So he will try to do things that he thinks are good for America. But what's good for America is what makes him think that he's received praise or is the center of attention or makes the decisions. He has the power. That's the man. And so that is profoundly, that's almost the archetype of a totalitarian. It's the archetype. That's what it is. That's who he is. So separation of powers, rule of law. If the rule of law is in the way, then it's in the way. Laws are good if they support what I want to do. That's the man. So I've been saying, and the man has met the moment, or the moment has found the man, because these impulses and perceptions and desires and resentments have been surging for decades prior to his rise to actual national power. So I've said for a decade, this is literally true, and pardon me for a moment of self-praise and self-quoting, which we should never do, that the United States faces the greatest crisis to our culture, society, and institutions, to our democracy, since at least 1861, when most will know the American Union split in two, and we had a hideous civil war for 4 years. And I argue, actually, the greatest crisis in our history. Why? Because even during our Civil War, the government and its norms, its ideals, were largely supported. And the point of the war was for half of them to affirm them. And now all of those norms and structures are being rejected by a significant portion, rejected and even explicitly, simply viscerally, out of grievance, resentment, and hope, in a way that undermines the fabric of what has been America structurally and culturally. So I'm profoundly I wake up sick to my stomach, literally. They are. My dismay, though, is that for the long time, I suppose, like most everybody else, thought, well, okay, if we can lay the facts out, then people will understand that Hillary Clinton is not running a pedophile brothel in the basement of a pizza parlor that I used to frequent, actually. That's but that's not true. You can lay the facts out, and it doesn't matter. People will still they'll believe this. And Steven Pinker, the social psychologist, I recently read one of his books and he makes a good distinction that, well, day to day, these people actually don't believe that Hillary Clinton is running this pedophile brothel, but it serves their purposes to identify. It's sort of virtue projecting, or there's a term for this. That if you say that that's the case, you can demonize the other side, the other, and affirm your own convictions and belonging in your tribe. And so your little league in the American context, or pub friend, maybe in the British context, can be totally normal and buy you a pint and realize that there's no difference between a half liter and a pint. But in this cultural context, they actually believe without acting upon most of the time these cockamamie views, so that facts are irrelevant in the debate. And it seems the only way to change them is that people follow their leaders. And if the leader says the earth is flat, people, a large percentage of people will believe it. And if he says no, it's actually round, then reality will return. It seems that there's sort of no way past that. But my father taught me a lesson which I didn't quite consciously. I remember consciously not wanting to accept. He was involved in local politics for a good part of his life, and he said to me, and I always thought he was a bit. He saw the half empty part of the glass, half of the glass, rather than the half full. So I tried to resist this and say, well, Dad, but it's also half full. And he said, Glenn, I could stand in front of, at the pulpit of a church and announce, I bring good tidings, Christ has returned. What could be better in a church setting? And I guarantee you that instantaneously half of the congregation will oppose me because I simply made that statement. So that's how it invariably is. Elections will turn always on 2 or 3%, even in the best of circumstances. A landslide is 54 to 46% victory. And he said, so the truth is quite secondary to how people will act.
I'm proud to say that this series of Ukrainian Advent interviews is supported by The Steel Porcupine, a unique and powerful film about a country that refuses to lie down, a people who turn themselves into a fortress of needles when Russian tanks rolled in. The Steel Porcupine is an unforgettable cinematic experience that exposes Russia's campaign of extermination in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people's spirit to resist and prevail. It follows soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary people who decided that survival meant resistance, not submission. Introduced by Nate Vance, a former US Marine who fought for 3 years in Ukraine's defense, this documentary moves from the Bucha massacre to genocide endorsing Russian state propaganda media. The Steel Porcupine is a love letter to Ukraine and a battle cry. It is free to watch and has already had a great impact on policymakers as well as activists. There is, of course, a link in the description of this video and in the comments as well. You can get to the website where you can see both the trailer and the film for free. Created by the makers of the acclaimed To the Zero Line, this is another film about humanity that clearly states there is no such thing as neutrality when war crimes are being committed systematically by Russia and on a scale in Europe only comparable to World War II. Set to a haunting soundtrack featuring music by Philip Glass and blending rare archival footage with original material. It is an impactful work of art and storytelling as well as being informative. I strongly recommend you watch it, but even the trailer itself is compelling.
I feel terrible about it because Ukraine is a very important country, and I feel a personal stake because I got them to agree to give up their nuclear weapons, and none of them believe that Russia would have pulled this stunt if Ukraine still had their weapons. And I believe Europe and the United States should continue to support Ukraine. There may come a time when the Ukrainian government believes that they can think of a peace agreement they could live with, but I don't think the rest of us should cut and run on them.
Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military have been underestimated for a period of several years now. And ultimately, I'm convinced from my reflections in observing from an intelligence standpoint that they will fight with their bare hands if they have to, if they don't have terms that are acceptable to an enduring peace.
So this is a design for a 3D printed drone frame. The engines are mounted here. The drone motors are mounted here and here and here. What I can do is export these shapes into the slicer
This film has absolute moral clarity. It does not both sides the war. It does not use neutral language. This is a film that says clearly who invaded whom, who is killing whom, and who is standing on their own land, fighting back, showing why Ukrainians will bleed for every meter. This film is not meant to comfort you. It's meant to arm you with clarity, with solidarity, and with the stubborn, spiky hope that democracies can still fight back and win.
Children are not stupid. They're just small, right? They're just small versions of us. They know exactly who the threat is. There's almost no families within Ukraine who have not lost a family member or have had a family member maimed by Putin and his army.
The Ukrainian people are very resourceful and they're very determined, and they've got a very good reason to be determined. Russia wants to exterminate the Ukrainian nation and just enslave it and absorb it. So they've got every reason to do everything necessary to win this war.
Putin was super clear when he started this war that the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign and free country was an unacceptable affront to Russian security. He will not stop until Ukraine isn't a country anymore.
We have to put Ukraine in a position of strength, that it has the means to fortify and protect itself from the economic survival to the military resilience. It's basically turning Ukraine into a steel porcupine that is indigestible for potential invaders.
Poets have spent their entire lives trying to explain the horrors of war. I am no poet. Anyone who has seen what I have seen would probably think differently about the situation in Ukraine and what the Russians are doing.